On 10 August, after 47 days of fighting in Korea, the tide of battle in the Pusan beachhead is ebbing and flowing for both sides. United Nations forces are dug in along a 120-mile perimeter. Communist troops, still outnumbering ours more than 2 to 1, have thus far failed in their objective to drive UN forces into the sea or destroy them before we can take the offensive. At the southern end of our beachhead, Task Force Keene, consisting of units of the 25th Infantry Division, the 5th Regimental Combat Team, and the 1st Marine Brigade, are driving toward Chinju in our first offensive of the war. This counteroffensive throws back the Reds, who are about to launch a major attack only 35 miles from Pusan, key port for the entire beachhead. Southwest of Taegu, U.S. troops are reducing a communist bridgehead. South of Waiguan, U.S. troops are containing another bridgehead. North of Waiguan, a counterattack by South Korean troops pushes communists back across the river. Along the northern perimeter, west of Wisong, communists compel South Koreans to withdraw. At Pohang, Red troops have broken through the perimeter, threatening that port city and its airfield. However, to the north, South Koreans have recaptured Yeongdeok. In the air, Air Force, Navy, and Marine planes are giving support to ground troops along the perimeter. They also blast communications and military-industrial targets from Taegu to the North Koreans' northern border. Guns of United Nations ships also help in this mission. The struggle to defend the beachhead is a furious one, but we are holding. On 24 August, on the central sector, which is concerned with the defense of Taegu and the Naktong River line, engineers have built a pontoon bridge across a tributary of the Naktong. This pontoon bridge serves for the use of lighter vehicles and foot soldiers. But with increasing supplies moving in, there is need for a heavy equipment bridge. South Korean civilian labor is employed. Although in many sections, primitive native tools are still used, and although U.S. engineers depend greatly on Korean manpower, there is a change now since the early days of the war. Heavy construction equipment is becoming a familiar sight. An accumulation of this type of equipment, necessarily second in priority to arms and ammunition, is an indication of the vast bulk of supplies that are now being received. On 29 August, the British aircraft carrier Unicorn moves into Pusan Harbor. On deck are British troops bound for the Korean battlefront. Within a week, they are rushed to fight alongside 1st Cavalry troops east of Waiguan to help stop a threatened breakthrough along the Naktong River. These troops are the first infantrymen of a foreign nation to join in the United Nations police action. They are members of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, composed largely of Scotsmen and the Middlesex Regiment, most of whom hail from the London area. Almost all of these Britishers have served in Hong Kong for 6 months, where they underwent rigorous training in hilly country very similar to that of Korea. Except for the 3.5 bazooka and U.S.-supplied rations, these Britishers will use their own weapons and supplies. Their uniforms are jungle green, with only the regimental pipers wearing the kilts, which won the Scots the nickname, the Ladies from Hell. A C-47 transport plane is loaded with leaflets, which will be dropped over North Korean territory. These drops are being made frequently to counter enemy propaganda. The C-47 transports carry heavy loads of leaflets for long trips into North Korea. For shorter trips, T-6s are used. Safe conduct passes. If the leaflet is found on a North Korean soldier by his own officers, the penalty is death. Over enemy territory, the packets are thrown out, and the wind takes care of sorting and delivery. Enemy captives report that these messages are often memorized to avoid the danger of having the leaflet found on the person. On 30 August, the Reds are gaining in the south and in the central sector, but in the northeast, near Pohang, United States and South Korean units are holding their ground against heavy opposition. In this fight near Pohang is a company of the 24th Infantry Division supported by a platoon of tanks. These units are moving forward to attack a Red position called Hill 148, a ridge about 1 mile west of Pohang. The Communist drive in this area is a three-pronged thrust along the 10-mile front between Kigyi and Pohang. At this time, Pohang is in Allied hands. The enemy is infiltrating here, one group of unknown size having set up a roadblock south of Pohang, 3 miles behind the Allied lines. Infantry and tanks coordinate activities as they approach the jumping-off point. Intelligence has revealed that the Communist attack on Pohang is an attempt to fulfill orders given the local Red commander to take the city at all costs in the next 24 hours. And for the Reds, it is a costly operation. An estimated 2,000 North Koreans have been killed in the last 2 days. Although U.S. elements are here in some strength, the weight of the attack is against the South Korean Army's 3rd and Capital Divisions and their 17th Regiment. This is the 10th week of the Korean War, and the fighting on all fronts has reached a peak of fury. Although at this time, military spokesmen are mentioning early offensive moves, the present situation does not appear optimistic. Enemy fire is encountered. Information goes back to the company commander. The CO's orders come forward. The attack on Hill 148 is about to begin. The attack gets underway, slowly at first, and then with an increasing firefight. This is one small action in the big fight that is raging along the entire 150-mile front in Korea. A few miles of territory changes hands again and again. If the Allied line cracks at any point, the whole Pusan beachhead can be lost.
Those were trying times for all of us. Our troops jammed into the small area of the Pusan perimeter, defending against great odds, and at the same time, building strength for the eventual offensive. Lieutenant Tom Dreisenstock was there. Tom served as a platoon leader with the Army's 24th Division. Tom, tell us what the defense around the perimeter was like.
The defense around the Pusan perimeter consisted mostly of a plugging action. In other words, moving a division into the perimeter to fill up a gap penetrated by the enemy. And we did not have enough men to completely fill up a complete rectangle or a perimeter, so therefore we had to plug up the gaps and by moving the men around.
Mm-hmm. When trouble started, you moved men right in there.
That's right.
Well, what were these attacks like, Tom?
Well, these attacks were constituted mostly by a preparation of a mortar fire by the enemy. They were very good at this mortar fire, and they outnumbered us, I would say, approximately 5 to 1. They had a mass of men, and also they infiltrated in between our lines dressed as civilians, and all together just harassed us by that type of movement.
Well, tell us about the breakout, Tom. What were the preparations for it like?
Well, the preparations consisted of getting ready, getting our ammunition ready, getting our men ready, and the briefings. The higher powers around there said that they believed that the North Korean perimeter around our defense was made up of a thin crust, and that once we penetrated that and broke through, we would be able to continue up north without too much trouble.
That's about the way it worked, too, isn't it?
Yes, that's the way it did work.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about the teamwork as you moved north? How about our air support? Was it good? Did you have it when you wanted it?
The air support was very good. You call for an airstrike and get it almost immediately. One time I was with my platoon, taking a village, and we received firing from a hill to our left front. I called back and asked for air attack, And within 5 minutes, we had planes coming over and giving us an attack within about 50 yards to our front, which is pretty close.
It certainly is. That's really getting it in there when you need it.
It is.
Well, Tom, how about the artillery at that time?
The artillery also was very good. The coordination was close. They gave us very good fire, accurate fire, and the North Koreans were scared to death of the white phosphorus which they fired. It seemed to have a very bad effect on them, and actually it was good for us. The artillery was excellent.
Well, we heard a lot of talk about the fanaticism of the North Koreans. Can you give us any examples of that?
Yes, I can. My platoon was taking a house one time which housed several members of the Communist Party. We surrounded the house and had an interpreter ask them to come out and surrender, and they refused to do it. Therefore, we had to fire on the house, and as many of them ran out, they shot themselves, and the others pulled pins on grenades and blew themselves up. They just did not want to be captured at all.
Well, Tom, tell us about the weapons we used over there. How did our weapons compare with those used by the North Koreans?
Our weapons were far superior to those of the North Koreans. They were more dependable, our men knew better use of them, and all in all, they gave out more firepower. The Browning automatic rifle, for instance, is my favorite, and the North Koreans were deathly afraid of it. It was a very good weapon, and there was no comparison between it and the North Korean Burke gun, as I call it.
Had pretty much respect for that BAR of ours, didn't they?
They really did. They were really scared of it.
Well, now, Tom, when you're in the line with your men like that, moving for a long time, you get to know them pretty well, don't you?
Yes, you do. You eat with them, you sleep with them, and every once in a while one of them gets shot, and you really feel bad. You get to know them very well. Sergeant Tompkins, who was my platoon sergeant, was an old soldier. He was the type of man who really knows his business, and I owe a lot of credit to him for helping me into the platoon. We had younger men. I got to know those too. Our squad leaders, Freddie, Smokey, and those boys, you really get to know them fairly well. Back around the Pusan perimeter before we broke out, because of the fact that we were shifting around an awful lot, it was very hard to try and size up your men. But regardless of this fact, I believe that we did fairly good, and I got a good chance to more or less size up my men. We were moving around quite a bit at that time, though.
Well, Tom, it was men like you and the men of your platoon that held back the enemy in the Pusan perimeter against very great odds. You kept that enemy from throwing us back into the sea. Let's watch now as some of our troops throw off a Red attack.
On 2 September, in the south central sector, the 1st Marine Brigade is rushed to the battle lines near Yongsan to help throw back one of the main communist thrusts in their all-out offensive along the Nak Tong River. Communist strategy at this time is an attempt to achieve a major breakthrough between the 2nd Division's southern flank and the 25th Division's northern flank. These Marines have been rushed here after a brief rest, during which they regrouped. The Marines move up the high ground they must retake to secure their sector of the counterattack. The enemy is holding his fire momentarily. The Marine counteroffensive has been coordinated with the 2nd Division, the entire action being 5-pronged. One tank-supported Marine unit has moved up the main road leading west from Yongsan, while diagonally on the right and left, other Marines flank the enemy. Farther to the right and left, tank-supported 2nd Division troops advance in wide encircling movements. Marines run forward as the enemy opens fire. A wounded Marine runs back for aid. Other Marines resume the attack, moving slowly and waiting for the enemy to reveal his flanks and main position. Despite North Korean tanks, mortars, and automatic weapons, the assault continues. This counterattack along this southern bulge of the Nak Tong River is almost a repeat of an assault these same Marines launched 2 weeks previous when they took this same hill. The high ground in this sector has changed hands at least 5 times in 2 weeks. The Marines form a base of fire to drive the enemy off. The line builds up, and so does the firepower. Meanwhile, overhead, Air Force and Marine Corps planes support the ground troops. Carrier planes are ready for another strike on inland targets. Rockets are of particular interest at this time. 3 different types are being used. One of the first super explosive types to see service in Korea was the 5-inch Holy Moses. Later, the 11.75-inch Tiny Tim proved highly effective on bridges and similar large targets. The most recent arrival is the Navy's 6.5-inch Ram. Constant activity on these carriers has not dampened the crewman's sense of humor. It is noteworthy that the Ram rocket set a speed record for production. From its conference room conception to its appearance in combat, it took only 24 days. Aerial missions of the Navy and Marines often include both strategic and tactical action in the same strike. In the relatively small area of Korea, targets of opportunity count heavily. Gun cameras record targets of the carrier planes. Iwakuni, Japan. A B-26 raid is in preparation during the week of 6 September. The B-26 is armed with 16 50-caliber machine guns. These guns are electrically operated, and a single gunner can bring many of them to bear on the same target at once. The B-26 can carry a 5,000-pound bomb load, or 5 of these 1,000-pounders. With these bombs, plus napalm, plus the heavy firepower of the machine guns, a B-26 flight is a formidable attacking unit. These planes have seen constant use in the Korean War, their targets ranging from strategic industrial areas in the north to tactical areas along the battle lines in the south. The B-26 is classified as a light bomber with a speed of more than 350 miles an hour. After their final briefing, crew members head for the field. This has become a familiar scene in United States air bases in Japan, from which B-26 sorties are flown on an around-the-clock schedule. These B-26 Douglas Invaders were formerly called A-26 bombers. They differ from the B-26 Martin Marauders used in World War II. The present B-26 is a very adaptable plane, which is often revamped for different purposes. Cannon may be substituted for the nose gun. The plane can be adapted to carry a variety of explosives, for the B-26 is designed primarily for low-level bombing. It is seldom used for the high-altitude work of the B-29. Targets are in the area of Seoul during the first week of September. The little flashes of light on the ground are tracers from the B-26 machine guns. Occasionally, enemy flak comes up at the planes. On 7 September, the U.S. Air Force flew 625 sorties in 24 hours. On 15 September, dawn breaks off the island of Waldy. Ships of the UN fleet fire point blank at the island. Rockets join the softening up process. General MacArthur watches from the bridge of the flagship. This landing is a calculated risk. General MacArthur is using many of his reinforcements from the south. The first wave hits the beach. Because of the 30-foot tide fall, landing craft in the first waves must be run ashore in a period 1 hour before high tide and 2 hours after. The first troops landed here will have to stick it out alone until the next tide, 11 hours later. A bulldozer smothers a red dugout. Fight begins. All the Reds haven't been driven off by the bombardment. Captives are stripped to prevent concealment of weapons. Others are a little more formal. On 16 September, the 1st Marine Division moves through Incheon. This city is recaptured against relatively light resistance. Allied casualties are few. As these men move through Incheon, their objective is Seoul. There are 2 Allied moves on Seoul, one from the south and another sweeping around from the north across the Han River. Han is crossed, a river village is taken, and the Marines move on toward Seoul. But there is bitter fighting ahead. Seoul is heavily defended. As these vehicles move on toward Seoul, the Marines have a message for the Reds. Enjoy yourself. It's later than you think. During the 6 weeks between 10 August and 20 September, the period covered by this combat bulletin, there were 3 main phases in the Korean fighting. On 10 August, reinforced United Nations forces were dug in to defend at all costs a beachhead perimeter bounded by the Naktong River. We could withdraw no farther, could no longer trade space for time if we were to hold our beachhead and the vital supply port of Pusan. Communist forces were threatening Pohang, Taegu, and Masan in their drive at Pusan. We had launched our first counterattack from Masan toward Chinju to stop the most dangerous communist drive. On 1 September, the communists launched their biggest drive of the war, all along our beachhead perimeter. It was an all-out effort to take Pusan, eliminate our beachhead in Korea, and destroy United Nations forces. We were being pushed back again toward Masan. Taegu was in danger from the north and south, and Pohang was being taken and retaken. By 20 September, the tide of battle had changed completely. 5 days previously, U.S. Marines had made an amphibious landing at Incheon, 150 miles behind the enemy lines. The enemy, still pressing his all-out drive for Pusan, was suddenly cut off from his supplies. On 20 September, U.S. Marines were entering the outskirts of Seoul as U.S. 7th Division infantrymen fanned southward to head off communists retreating from the southern front. On our southern beachhead, United Nations forces were crossing the Naktong River and moving ahead everywhere. They were advancing at Pohang, south of Wisong, north of Taegu and at Waiguan, west of Changyong, and west of Masan. We had held our beachhead. Now we were on the offensive, and it was the beginning of the end for the communist invasion of South Korea.
From 20 June to 20 July, attention in Korea is focused on Kaesong, site of ceasefire peace negotiations. The first meeting is scheduled for 10 July. The UN negotiators establish a base camp near Munsan, commuting to each of the conferences at Kaesong. On 21 July, the Communists request a recess in the peace negotiations. It has become apparent by this time that the Reds are staging a buildup of force above the neutralized Kaesong area. However, during this period, only minor changes occur in the Korean battle line as action is confined to patrols and minor clashes. This limited fighting continues as further truce developments are in the offing. From the beginning, the Kaesong story is the story of stalemate. It began late in June when Russia's Malik suggested peace talks. And of course, the North Koreans and Chinese Red volunteers were ready to listen. Kaesong has been agreed upon as a neutral zone of conference. The first representatives, with no rank to exceed that of colonel, leave Munsan, the site of the UN peace camp, on 8 July. They have been instructed to make no commitments for the UN. They are limited to establishing an agenda for future talks and to assuring safe conduct to UN delegates during the armistice meetings. They are empowered to come to agreement on what is to be discussed, to make it clear to the communists that the armistice talks must take up military matters only. With this program and these limitations clearly understood, the helicopter bearing the general's representatives takes off from Munsan. At Kaesong, the letter W, which marks the landing strip, is taken to mean welcome. Later, UN reporters insist it stands for the Korean word for stalling. Keep in mind that the communists rejected General Ridgway's suggestion that the talks be held aboard a Dutch hospital ship. They requested Kaesong within their own lines as a neutral meeting place. Nevertheless, the UN negotiators follow their host to the courtyard with open minds. The uniformed Chinese woman turns out to be not a high official, as was first supposed, but a competent interpreter. She was the only uniformed woman they saw. The town of Kaesong gives the impression of peace and tranquility. Early pictures of the Conference on Agreement reveal nothing of the tension that prevails, of the long arguments over simple matters of procedure, nor do the UN representatives return to Munsan with much that is significant for the waiting reporters. Their attitude, their poker faces, seem to say only, wait and see. But it was later learned that during that first conference, and the one of 11 July, the communists took pictures of UN representatives being stopped at roadblocks by armed Reds. Those pictures, widely distributed throughout Asia, suggested that vanquished UN forces were seeking peace from their victorious enemy. Totally unaware of this, Admiral Joy leaves Munsan for his first meeting with the North Koreans and representatives of the Chinese communists, who have given up the pretext of being volunteers and do most of the talking. Admiral Joy is quite willing to have it so, knowing full well that the North Koreans are no longer in a position to make any decisions of their own. The communist negotiators arrive with an attitude of arrogant overconfidence. Even while the first armistice talks begin, armed Reds are in evidence within the very shadow of the conference room. True, no guns are drawn, nobody gets hurt. But the propaganda value of these pictures also taken by the Reds and distributed throughout Asia, do irreparable harm to the stature of UN forces, the same forces which had, in truth, inflicted losses on the Reds to a ratio of 100 to 1. However, the first conference ends without incident, without too much friction, but certainly without decision. Admiral Joy could only say the talks would continue so long as there was the slightest hope for agreement. But he does not fail to observe the armed communists playing soldier close by the medieval-like castle that is to serve as his billet. An imposing pile of stone inside of which somebody had forgot to put a latrine. But petty annoyances do not prevent the Admiral and his staff from relaxing after this first historic meeting. He is obviously aware that the Orientals will bargain with characteristic deliberation, whether they truly want peace or only time to regroup their scattered forces. Even at this first meeting with Admiral Joy, the Reds ignore General Ridgway's request that the talks be confined to military matters. But when Admiral Joy and his staff return to Munsan, the door to peace is not slammed shut. It is still ajar. Neither the delegates nor General Ridgway's staff have much to say to the anxiously waiting UN correspondents. But the reporters do learn that the Reds had full press representation at the meeting. The UN correspondents are quickly promised that they will be allowed to attend all future meetings.
In a few minutes, we'll return to our film and the story of the truce negotiations at Kaesong. But first, we'd like you to meet Sergeant Jim Heidenreich, who was a combat engineer and a rifleman with the 1st Cavalry Division in Korea. Well, Jim, you saw this town of Kaesong, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
Well, what was it like?
Well, Kaesong, before the war especially, was a beautiful town. It's known as one of the most beautiful in that part of the East. It's a western city in all aspects. It has modern conveniences, had streetcars, and so forth, electricity.
Well, that's something a lot of us didn't realize, Jim. Well, now let's talk about you. What was your job with the 1st Cav?
I had a anti-tank and mine platoon. Anti-tank and mine platoon is something new in the Army. It is a more or less engineer troubleshooting team attached on an infantry regiment level. Our job was to go out with the infantry, remove mines, lay mines, in some cases pick up booby traps and actually lay them.
Well, that's not the safest job in the world, Jim.
No, it wasn't.
Well, now, there were other combat engineers with the 1st Cavalry Division. There were a lot of jobs to be done. And perhaps one of the most important, Jim, was bridge building. Isn't that right?
That's true. In engineering, bridge building is always important. I remember just north of Chunshan, the 8th Engineers, attached to the 1st Cavalry, had been ordered to build a bridge across the Pukan River. It was necessary to build a bridge to get the troops across the Pukan to a staging area for the attack to the north to the Iron Triangle area. The engineers worked for 4 days under adverse weather conditions. Well, 4 days and 4 nights, because they had to work at night under floodlights.
Under floodlights?
Under floodlights, and you can really appreciate that when you realize that they were located 200 to 300 yards ahead of our front lines and had for security a company from the 16th Recon to support them and protect them. And they were under constant harassing mortar fire and long-range machine gun and rifle fire for the entire time.
Now, this bridge meant we could get our tanks and our infantry across and keep on going, huh?
That's correct. Of course, in history now, they actually crossed the river, made the attack north, and were successful. And they could not have been done without the engineers.
Well, when our infantry tank teams moved out, Jim, certainly the engineers were with them.
That's true, and it's not as well known, but actually the engineers can be said to spearhead such advances. On your tank infantry patrol and any of your tank infantry assaults, the first tank is an engineer tank. It's supposed to have only engineers on it. It'll have from 1 to 3 engineers on it with mine detecting equipment. If they get into an area where it is known that mines exist, they'll dismount, go forward and clear a lane ahead of the tanks and the infantry. Or if they hit a mine, of course, they'll dismount and clear a lane for the assault. So they can be said to spearhead it, in as much as the attack can only go as fast as they go if it's in a mined area.
Well, Jim, you've given us a good idea of the work of the combat engineers with our riflemen in Korea. But now let's talk about you. What are you doing now?
I'm a senior instructor in photogrammetry, or rather map making, at Fort Belvoir.
Fort Belvoir, Virginia?
That's
Home of the
correct.
engineers, right?
Home of the engineers, that's right.
Well, thanks again, Jim, and a lot of luck to you. And now let's return to Korea in July and August of 1951 and resume our story of the truce negotiations at Kaesong.
But even as the delegates returned to Kaesong, accompanied by the press of the some 16 nations with troops in Korea, it seems that the Reds are preparing a strange welcome indeed. They did not intend to give up the power and propaganda of a single red voice, crying its slanted news to the outside world. Already in the hands of Chinese communists was ample evidence by word and picture of how the Reds had distorted the news from Kaesong. For while the conference thus far had not even discussed the agenda originally agreed on because of the haggling of the Reds, Peking radio and newspapers were avidly reporting each meeting as a failure of the UN negotiators to meet honorable terms of the victors. This impression had to be corrected. General Ridgway bids goodbye to the correspondents. The general makes sure that all of them have availed themselves of the opportunity to report the true situation at Kaesong. But outside of Kaesong, they encounter a situation that shocks the free world. The reporters are met and stopped by armed Reds. This commissar of press relations is telling the correspondents of 16 United Nations that the world will hear of the armistice talks through the truthful communist press. Not in the history of modern ceasefire negotiations has there been such a crude breach of international law and ethics. The communists are anxious to have the rest of the vehicles continue without the newsmen, but UN officers refuse to break up the convoy. Further discussions fail to resolve the problem. The Red refusal to pass the complete convoy is relayed back to Munsan. The convoy is instructed to return if not passed by 0930. At the 0930 deadline, the vehicles turn around and head for Munsan. They promptly make their report to General Ridgway of the high-handed treatment they had received at Kaesong. The general's decision is immediate and decisive. Within a short period of time, the world was receiving General Ridgway's ultimatum from the lips of his aide, General Allen.
This is Brigadier General Frank A. Allen, Jr., United States Army, Chief of Information, United Nations Command, Advance Camp in Korea, broadcasting a message from General M.B. Ridgway, Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command, to General Kim Il-young. Since the first meeting at Kaesong, your delegation has placed restrictions upon the movement of our delegation. It has subjected our personnel to the close proximity of your armed guards. It has delayed and blocked passage of our couriers. It has withheld its cooperation in the establishment of two-way communications with our base, even though it agreed to do so immediately. It has refused admittance to the conference area of certain personnel in our convoy, which I desired, and for whose conduct I stated as I assumed full responsibility. The extension of the present recess and the delay in resuming the conference of our delegations is solely due to these unreasonable and unnecessary restrictions against which my representatives have repeatedly protested. The assurances which I require are simple and few. They include as primary prerequisites the establishment of an agreed conference area of suitable extent, completely free of armed personnel of either side. Each delegation must have complete reciprocity of treatment to include complete and equal freedom of movement to, from, and within the agreed conference area, and complete and equal freedom at all times in the selection of the personnel in its delegation party to include representatives of the press. I therefore now propose that a circular area with its center at approximately the center of Quezon and with a 5-mile radius be agreed upon as a neutral zone. The eastern limit of the neutral zone shall be the present point of contact of our forces at Panmunjom. I propose that we both agree to refrain from hostile acts of any kind within this zone during the entire period of our conferences. I propose that we agree that the area of the conference site and the roads leading thereto, used by personnel of both delegation parties, be completely free of armed personnel. Should you continue to insist that restrictions are necessary for our personal safety or for any other reason, I propose that the conference site be moved to a locality which will afford the few simple assurances I have specified herein. Signed, M.B. Ridgway, General, United States Army, Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command. That is all.
The communist bluff has been called. The general's terms are quickly accepted without argument. On 15 July, the armistice talks are resumed. The UN delegates return to Quezon with a full complement of reporters, radio equipment, and cameras. From now on, no white flags will be carried to be misinterpreted by enemy press, and only the agreed-on minimum of red MPs are cited. Although the Reds attempt to belittle the controversy that stalled negotiations, the UN delegation is relieved of the tension created by the ominous presence of the Reds' submachine guns. The inscrutable communist delegates give no indication that they have been caught red-handed trying to pull a fast one. Admiral Joy is hopeful of progress now, since the Reds have made their first definite concession. But though the UN correspondents now have freedom of activity, they are hard put to keep busy during the days of 15 to 21 July. The conference produces little that is newsworthy. There is, however, one happy result. For the first day within 53 weeks of fighting, 24 hours pass in which not one U.S. soldier is killed. It seems evident now that at least the communist reporters and cameramen are ready and anxious to be friendly. Another conference ends with the Reds insisting that the military demarcation line must be at the 38th parallel, and they insist on discussing political matters that must be left to the UN Assembly. The communists have given the UN negotiators assurance of complete freedom of movement within a half-mile radius of the conference building and in the neutral corridor from Munsan. Telephone communications are set up from Quezon to the Munsan peace camp. To ensure reliable radio communications, North Mountain near Seoul is selected as the site for the construction of a relay station. This station is part of the radio network connecting Munsan with 8th Army headquarters in Seoul and General Ridgway's offices in Tokyo. The altitude of the mountaintop reduces interference by surrounding hills and increases the effective range of the station. While the ceasefire talks are going on, UN commanders are keeping close contact with the enemy in the field and preventing him from gaining ground. However, it is apparent that the communists are staging a large-scale buildup of troops, particularly above Khe Sanh. There is formal acceptance at this time by General Nam Il of the principle that hostilities will continue until an armistice can be fully worked up. These armed Chinese being chased from the conference area are forerunners of more who will later march through Khe Sanh and cause still another ultimatum. During the week 15 to 21 July, the negotiators agreed to list 3 points on the agenda for the ceasefire talks. 1, the physical details of stopping the fighting. 2, the definition of the ceasefire line. 3, safeguards against resumption of the fighting. The Reds also want to list another topic, to wit, the withdrawal of foreign troops from Korea. Admiral Joy refuses to accept this as part of the agenda. This firmness by the UN negotiators causes General Nam Il to request a 4-day recess, presumably for further instruction. The request is granted. The conference table is empty, except perhaps for the ever-present spirit of Jake Malik, past master of the stall and the double talk.
The world spotlight was on the Korean truce talks at this time, and too often it was forgotten that the infantryman was still in his hole, still in the line, doing that same job. That's the man we'd like to talk about right now. Lieutenant Robert Fallon, who led these riflemen in battle in Korea, knows these men. Bob?
This has been the infantry soldiers' war, and never in this country's history has any war required him to be so skillful. He's had to master the use of a dozen different weapons. He's had to learn the stealth of the Indian in night combats and patrols, and the hardiness of the Eskimo in staying alive in sub-zero weather. And again, never has any campaign ever required him to be so tough. These are the things that the American people have asked him to do. We've asked him to fight in a land thousands of miles from his home. We've asked him to risk his life daily. And the only reason that he's really aware of for this is that the American people have asked him to. That there's none of the compulsion of the Civil War when the men were defending their homelands, and none of the national dedication of the big world wars when the entire world was inflamed. No, he's fighting today because we've asked him to fight. But that's good enough for him. We've asked him to endure temperatures 30 degrees colder than those known to the gallant men that followed George Washington into Valley Forge. We've asked him to undergo 3 trying and difficult withdrawals, one of them in the bitter, merciless heat of summer, and the 2 others in the misery and cold of a Manchurian winter. And all of them against odds at times more staggering than those faced by the valiant defenders of Bataan. 3 times we've asked him to turn and stand against these odds. The American infantryman dug his hole and manned his weapons, and he held. And he held at a place where very often the tanks and the ships and the planes were of no use to him, on those frozen hillsides of Korea. He did this job, and he did it well, and at a time when many were saying it could not be done. And who is this American infantryman? He's a man who but a short time ago was sitting in his comfortable living room, even as you. Now he's awaiting with dread the bitter, endless winter night, when to sleep often means not to awaken. He's the next-door neighbor who accepted with such delight the extra piece of roast beef you offered him when he was over to your house last summer for supper. Now he's hacking away at a can of beef stew, which is frozen solid. Or perhaps he's the laundryman who used to deliver your bundle of spotless linen each week. Now he very often doesn't change his shirt for 2 months. This man, whom you know so well, is now a part of an unbeaten body of fighting men, the American infantrymen. He's you, your soldier, in that distant land now because you've asked him to be there.
There's nothing anyone can add to what Lieutenant Fallon has said. Thank you, Bob. And thanks, too, to Sergeant Jim Heidenreich, who appeared earlier in our program. Next week, we'll have the final program in our Big Picture series. We'll show you what patrol action was like in Korea. You'll see an infantry attack on Hill 1179. You'll see the return of refugees to the city of Seoul. And with us next week will be 2 Signal Corps combat cameramen, 2 of the many cameramen who filmed the Big Picture in Korea. This is Captain Carl Zimmerman, inviting you to be with us then.